So let's call this guy Marco. And Marco's going through a lot. He's very successful, he just inherited his family's fabric business, but he's dealing with a lot of anxiety and depression. And one day he goes to see a psychiatrist, this guy, who we'll call Doc. And Doc is well known, he's like the best in the business, he allegedly treats Gwyneth Paltrow and Courtney Love. So Marco goes to Doc and he starts seeing him on the regular. And Doc's sessions are a little different than other psychiatrists. He takes his patients on walks where he has them take him to a restaurant during their sessions. It gets very personal. But his methods seem to work for Marco, because over time he starts to feel a little better. And he really starts to trust Doc, like with his life. In fact, Marco trusts Doc so much, he starts to run all his business decisions by him. And Doc will advise him on this stuff. Now Marco also has a sister who we'll just call Sister. And Sister finds out that Doc's been advising Marco on the family fabric business, and she doesn't like it one bit. And tension starts to form between her and Marco. So of course, Marco talks to Doc about all this tension he has with his sister, because he talks to Doc about everything. And ultimately, Doc advises Marco to cut ties with his sister completely. In fact, Doc pushes Marco to abandon a lot of his personal and romantic relationships, which Marco does, because Marco completely trusts Doc, because Doc has never steered Marco wrong. Until, over time, Doc starts asking Marco for things. Nothing too life-changing, like, hey, can I use your house to host a party for my friends? And Marco trusts Doc, so he's like, sure, buddy. But then, over the course of years and years, Doc starts asking for bigger and bigger things. And Marco trusts Doc, so he would say yes. And at some point, Doc comes asking Marco if he can live in a vacation house that Marco owns. Because Marco has this huge house in the Hamptons, and Marco's like, sure, you can live there. So Doc and his wife move in, and they start living in Marco's vacation home. And it keeps going, because Doc keeps asking for more and more. And soon he has Marco running errands for him. Doc has him doing yard work, helping throw lavish parties, printing out invitations, and the asks just continue to grow. And eventually he asks Marco, hey, can I use some of your money to open a charity? Or hey, can you give me an executive position at your fabric company? Or hey, can I be a signatory on your bank account? Doc even asks Marco to change his will so that Doc's wife will inherit everything after Marco dies. So over the course of 30 years, everything that Marco owns has slowly been commandeered by his own psychiatrist. And Marco's such a nice, agreeable guy that he doesn't realize how fucked up all this is. Until one day, Marco gets a hernia, and he has to get surgery and spend quite a bit of time in the hospital. And while he's there, he starts to get lonely. And he ends up asking himself, where the hell is Doc? I mean, this is a major surgery. Doc hasn't visited, he hasn't called to check on me, not even once. And he suddenly realizes that Doc had pushed him away from not only his sister, but many romantic and personal relationships over the years, so that Doc would be his only friend. And there, stuck in the hospital, alone with his thoughts, he starts to get mad. And that's when he realizes Doc was never his friend. He was just using him to take control of all of his stuff. And so Marco is finally like, fuck Doc, I'm gonna take back control of my life. So he sends an angry letter to Doc telling him that he never wants to see him again. And he kicks him out of his home in the Hamptons. He immediately writes Doc and Doc's wife out of his will. It's liberating, and slowly, Marco starts getting his life back together. He makes amends with his sister, he brings her back into his life. He finally goes out and gets a girlfriend after all these years. And eventually, he ends up submitting a complaint against Doc to the New York Department of Health. Then the Department of Health investigates, and guess what they find? Doc apparently has a history of doing this to his patients, manipulating them, getting them to write him into their wills, stuff like that. So ultimately, the Department of Health strips Doc of his medical license, and he can no longer practice medicine in the state of New York. Good for Marco. Shout out to New York. So this is Tausha, and her story is insane. So one day, Tausha meets this guy, Mitch Kemp. And Tausha and Mitch Kemp, they fall in love, they get married, and they have a baby, a daughter. But unfortunately, it doesn't work out. So she quickly moves on and starts dating this guy, Greg. Now Tausha has moved on from Mitch Kemp, but Mitch Kemp wants custody of their daughter. So there's a lot of tension and arguing over this, and it gets really heated between them. So Tausha comes up with a plan to end this custody battle once and for all. So one day, she lures Mitch Kemp out to her farm, and that's where Greg comes out of nowhere and he shoots him. Then Mitch Kemp dies, and they bury the body out on the farm. And at this point, no one knows Mitch Kemp is dead. They only think he's missing. So Tausha and Greg eventually sell that farm. It's in Missouri, and they move to a new house out of state. Then one day, Greg has to go out of town for a while for work. And while Greg is out of town, Tausha starts hooking up with a new man, this guy, Keith. Then Greg comes home from out of town, and he finds Tausha together with Keith in his house. So Greg basically says, F you, and he divorces her. So now Tausha's dating Keith, and she moves in with him. And one night, they're getting drunk. In fact, she gets so drunk, she ends up telling Keith the story of how she had her ex, Mitch Kemp, murdered, and how she had convinced Greg to do it. And Keith's like, whatever, she's probably just drunk, bullshitting. And eventually, Tausha and Keith's relationship gets a little rocky, and she meets this guy, Dwayne. So she starts seeing Dwayne while she's technically still living with Keith. So she sees Dwayne for about a month, and then she ends up moving into his house. And then Dwayne has to go to Keith's place to help her move her stuff out. So Dwayne and Keith meet. And it's fine, they're both nice guys, so they don't have any problems. So now Tausha is living with Dwayne, and they don't have any issues, and everything seems to be going fine now. Until one day, Dwayne starts noticing something weird about Tausha's mail. A lot of it shows her having a different last name. In fact, several different last names. And Dwayne's like, okay, why does she have so many last names? So he starts doing Google searches on her and some of these last names. And he finds an old marriage license between her and Mitch Kemp, the husband Greg had unalived. And this is news to Dwayne, because Tausha had always told him she had never been married. So Dwayne confronts her about it. And she has to admit that not only has she been married before, but she's been married 5 times. And Dwayne's like, damn, 5 times? Because she's only 31. But despite that, they keep dating, but seems like Dwayne doesn't really trust her anymore. And then one day, something crazy happens. Tasha calls Dwayne and she's like, remember my ex, Keith? Will you go pick him up and give him a ride to the hospital? He OD'd on meth. Because of course he did. And Dwayne's a nice guy, so he drives and he picks up Keith and takes him to the hospital. And Keith ends up being fine, but on the way out, Dwayne starts asking him about Tasha and her history. And Keith tells him a lot, but specifically, Keith tells him about the time Tasha got drunk and confessed to having her ex-husband Mitch Kemp murdered. And both Keith and Dwayne think that that's super weird, but probably a little too weird to be true. Then fast forward to a few months later, and everything changes. Because Dwayne discovers that Tasha's been cheating on him with another man. Shocker. So he breaks up with her and he kicks her out of the house. After the breakup, one night Dwayne's at home and he's on his computer and he happens to have access to her social media accounts. So he starts looking through her messages and he finds messages to Tasha from family members of Mitch Kemp. Apparently, Mitch Kemp had been missing for a year and those family members had been writing Tasha over and over again asking her if she had heard from him. And Dwayne's suddenly like, holy shit, maybe Tasha did have Mitch Kemp murdered. So Dwayne prints out the messages, he takes them to police and he tells them everything he knows. And police start investigating. So first they gotta go find Tasha so they can question her. But by that time, Tasha has moved and she's living in Alabama with yet a new boyfriend. So police find her, they bring her in, they question her like, hey, do you know where Mitch Kemp is? And she says no, but she keeps changing her story. And after a lot of pressure from police, she eventually admits that yeah, Mitch Kemp is dead. But she says it wasn't her who unalived him. And she starts putting all the blame on her other ex-husband, Greg. And police are like, well, can you help us locate the body? Because from the police's perspective, it's hard to prosecute a murder when you don't have a body. And eventually Tasha gives in and she's like, sure, I'll show you where the body is. Because she thinks helping police find Mitch Kemp's body will help her get out of trouble. So they fly her out to Missouri and she shows them where Mitch Kemp's body is buried. And now police have a body. So now they can charge her with murder. So they immediately arrest her. Here's her mugshot. They also arrest Greg. Here's his mugshot. They all go to trial. Greg testifies against her, saying that she was the mastermind behind the whole murder. And Greg gets 19 years while Tasha is sentenced to life. That is wild. Shout out to Alabama, Florida, and Missouri. So let's call this guy Flip. And Flip is shocked because he just found his wife in the bathtub unalived. Now his wife is this woman, Shanti. And one day, back in the day, Flip meets Shanti on a dating site. And she's attractive and he's a millionaire. It's perfect. So they quickly fall in love and Flip moves from Minnesota to Florida to be with her. And a few years go by and Flip buys this house for them. It's 4,000 square foot, older style Victorian home. And he falls in love with this house because he sees the potential in it. And ultimately he wants to renovate it and make it more modern. So they move in and they start working on this big renovation. But strangely enough, even after they move into the house and they get married, Flip still hasn't put Shanti's name on the deed, which Shanti really wants him to do. Not only that, she's the one paying for all these big renovations. In fact, Flip, the millionaire, doesn't pay for anything. His cheap ass doesn't even pay for their groceries. And Shanti can't figure out why he's always skipping the bill for everything. Regardless, over time, Flip becomes obsessed with renovating this house. And a couple of years go by and they're still doing all these renovations. And they have very little to show for it. Not only that, at this point, Shanti has spent over $250,000 trying to fix this place up. So obviously Shanti is very unhappy. So then of course, they start fighting a ton. And it gets pretty bad. Like so bad, they're not even sleeping in the same bed. But despite how unhappy Shanti is, Flip is still obsessed with fixing this place up. And I don't think this situation could get any worse for Shanti. Until one day, Flip gets an idea that could fix all their problems. He wants to go on this reality show called Zombie House Flipping. It's a show where they find old rundown houses and they flip them. So they start meeting with producers for the show and producers check out their house and they're like, your house is a piece of shit. It's perfect. So then it all moves forward and eventually pre-production begins. Now Shanti is still really not happy and she's not feeling any of this reality TV show stuff. And it just gets worse for her because at some point around this time, somehow she learns that Flip has been lying to her. She discovers he really isn't a millionaire. He's never been a millionaire. He spent what little money he did have buying that house. And that is when things get really bad. And a couple of weeks before they're supposed to begin filming this reality show, they go and they meet with the producers. And it's at this meeting where Shanti finally snaps. And she's fed up with all of it. But this house has been a nightmare. It cost her $250,000 in renovations and now they're about to have a TV crew in there. Plus, Flip still won't put her name on the deed. So Shanti just says, F this, and she storms out at the end of the meeting, which realistically probably killed their chances of getting on the show. And this pisses Flip off because his obsession with his house has become his whole personality. At this point, he doesn't even have a job. He just oversees the renovations all day. Now, to be clear, I'm not 100% sure about the details of this next part, but it goes something like this. A few days after that meeting, Flip and Ashanti are at home, and I assume they start fighting because they had been fighting a lot. And that is when suddenly Flip freaks out and loses it, and he ends up beating her up, and then he strangles her until she is unalive. Then he puts her in the bathtub and he calls police. And when he talks to police, he tells them that he just found her there. Like, oh, she must have slipped and fell. But police are not buying his story. I mean, she's all beat up. She got strangle marks on her. She definitely did not fall in that tub. So eventually they arrest him. They charge him with first-degree murder. Here's his mugshot. He goes to trial. He's found guilty and he's sentenced to life. And all this happened in Florida, so shout out to Florida.